Have you ever witnessed a quiet farmer transform into a daring hero under the cover of night? In this gripping tale, Thomas Callahan finds himself outnumbered by a ruthless gang, only to unleash a hidden prowess that leaves everyone speechless. Imagine a peaceful farm exploding into chaos, bullet casings hitting the ground, makeshift traps lighting up the darkness, and an unlikely savior wielding just enough courage to stand his ground. This is the heart-stopping moment that you simply can't miss. Stick around until the very end of the story to see how this electrifying showdown unfolds and what surprising twist awaits those who dare challenge a man defending his home. And if you love stories packed with action, suspense, and unforgettable characters, please hit that subscribe button on Farmer's Story. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on more thrilling, heartwarming, and inspiring tales set in the simplest places, yet filled with extraordinary events. Thomas Callahan's farm stretched out under a sky of pale clouds on a late summer day. He was a tall, wiry man in his early 60s, leaning over a row of sprouting crops. Although dressed in faded overalls and a straw hat, there was something about his confident stance and the swift efficiency of his movements that hinted at abilities not typically associated with the simple farmer. Surrounding Thomas's property were rolling fields and a muddy gravel road that led back to the nearest town, a modest place composed of a diner, a feed store, and a post office. If strangers passed by, they saw only a quiet, out-of-the-way farm without any obvious drama. Yet, there was a subtle watchfulness in Thomas's demeanor, as though he anticipated something beyond the routine tasks of sowing and harvesting. In fact, an old memory had been tugging at him all morning. Long ago, on a stormy night, he had rescued a young family, Marcus and Linda Adams, and their two children, from the raging waters of a flood that had nearly swept their car off a crumbling bridge. That event had welded his fate to theirs in ways he couldn't have imagined at the time. Since then, Thomas had dedicated himself to a calmer life, focusing on the land and animals, rarely stepping off his property except for the supplies. Folks around the county had grown used to him as a quiet fixture, always polite, but never one to linger in social settings. Most had no idea of his background, the specialized skills he once wielded in faraway places. A handful of older residents swapped rumors about him serving in an elite unit, but Thomas neither confirmed nor denied such talk. In recent weeks, however, there was a new undercurrent of tension. Rumors had cropped up about a small but aggressive group looking to buy rural properties at dirt-cheap prices. Some said they were part of a larger criminal outfit, others pegged them as biker enforcers. Regardless, they were pressuring locals to sell, and those who resisted reported nighttime trespassing or ominous threats. Although the sheriff was sympathetic, his department had limited resources for patrolling remote farmland. A few neighbors mentioned these rumors to Thomas, who received the information with his usual calm nod, but their worried expressions lingered in his mind. He knew how intimidation escalated. If this group was persistent, it might test every boundary until it got what it wanted. And Thomas, though he disliked confrontation, had a personal rule. If pushed too far, he would do what he must to protect himself and those around him. So on that peaceful afternoon, as he walked past his weathered barn, Thomas couldn't help recalling the stormy night he had waded through floodwaters to save strangers. It was evidence that you never truly know when a quiet existence will be interrupted by crisis. Leaning against the trunk of an old oak tree, he cast a wary eye toward the horizon, wondering if those intruders, whoever they were, might soon find their way here. Years back, the flood had come without warning. Rain battered the countryside, turning brooks into raging torrents. Marcus and Linda Adams, along with their children, had been visiting relatives on the outskirts of the county when rising water consumed the low-lying bridge that led home. Their car stalled mid-crossing, its engine choked by swirling debris. Within seconds, the bridge buckled. The family barely escaped before the vehicle was wrenched away by the angry current. Cold, drenched, and stranded, they stumbled across the edge of Thomas Callahan's land, calling out for help in the pelting rain. Through the gloom, they spotted a faint glow moving in the darkness. A lantern. Thomas, alerted by the howling wind and the ominous roar of floodwaters, had ventured out to check for stranded animals or travelers. He guided the family to safer ground, forging a path through chest-high water with practiced calm. Marcus later recalled the surprising strength in Thomas's hands when he grabbed each family member to haul them out of dangerous eddies. Once they reached dry land, Thomas ushered them into his modest farmhouse, where he lit a wood stove and handed out spare blankets. While Linda comforted the children, Marcus attempted to pay Thomas for his help, pressing a damp wad of cash into his hand. Thomas politely refused, insisting he had done only what any decent person would do. Something about the way Thomas moved, swiftly laying out medical supplies, checking for injuries with a methodical air, led Marcus to suspect this was no ordinary farmer. Thomas never elaborated, simply saying, "You take care of your family." The storm raged through the night, but at dawn it subsided enough that the roads were partially passable. The Adams family departed, promising never to forget Thomas's generosity. True to their word, they exchanged cards and letters with him over the years, though their busy lives in the city meant they rarely had the chance to visit. For his part, Thomas continued much as before, growing crops, tending livestock, and generally keeping to himself. He neither asked for thanks nor showed any resentment that they stayed away. He was simply content to know they were safe. Still, neighbors occasionally observed hints of Thomas's past. One farmhand saw him swiftly dismantle a rusted rifle found in the barn, reassembling it with the ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times. Another caught sight of him scaling a broken silo ladder with more agility than most men half his age. Whispers circulated that maybe he'd served in some clandestine unit, stories fueled by the subtle sense of discipline in everything he did. All the while, the county carried on in its gentle, rural rhythm. Yet, in the present day, that rhythm was threatened. News of a pushy group scouring remote farms for forced buyouts spread like wildfire. Some neighbors had caved to fear, selling at shockingly low prices. Others held their ground, facing vandalism or the slaughter of livestock. Thomas heard all this with quiet concern, suspecting the day might come when these aggressors set their sights on his property, just as the flooded family once did, though with far different intentions. Over coffee at the local diner, a gathering spot for farmers and truckers, word about the suspicious newcomers grew more ominous. People mentioned a man named Wolf, rumored to be at the helm of a loose syndicate that blended biker-style intimidation with organized crime. Several families reported masked men on motorcycles showing up unannounced, offering buyouts for land. When those offers were refused, barns mysteriously burned, fences were cut, and at least one child was threatened. Most folks in the county weren't equipped to handle organized violence. They relied on the underfunded sheriff's department and placed their faith in the goodwill of neighbors. Thomas listened closely to these stories, uneasy but outwardly calm. If Wolf's gang was expanding, Thomas suspected they would eventually come knocking on his door. After all, his land was substantial, with well-maintained fields and a sizable barn that could be repurposed for illicit activities. Despite his tranquil life, Thomas's instincts from his earlier days of service had never fully vanished. Sooner or later, Wolf would realize that not every farmer was an easy mark. For the sake of the entire community, Thomas believed that if he had to stand up against these criminals, he would. His resolve was tested sooner than expected. One afternoon, he was mending fences along the southern edge of his property when a pack of motorcycles appeared on the dirt road. 5 men, their bikes rumbling like distant thunder, rode up and stopped. The leader wore a leather jacket emblazoned with a grim skull symbol, exactly the kind of emblem folks had described. The man removed his helmet, exposing a vicious scar down his left cheek. "Name's Wolf," the biker said, scanning Thomas's fields with a casual arrogance. "Heard you might sell this place if the price is right." It was no friendly inquiry. The tension in Wolf's voice carried a quiet threat. Thomas, lifting his gaze, kept his tone even. "Not interested." A silent moment passed as Wolf sized him up, clearly expecting fear or at least hesitation. Thomas offered neither. One of Wolf's companions sneered at Thomas's weathered overalls and the hammer in his hand. "You might want to think twice," he said, a smirk curling across his lips. Wolf lifted a gloved hand to silence him, then locked eyes with Thomas. "If you change your mind," he said coolly, "we'll be back." With that, they revved their engines and sped off, leaving a swirling cloud of dust in the lingering sense of a promise unfulfilled. Thomas watched them vanish around a bend. Intimidation tactics were all too familiar in his line of past experience. He knelt again, finishing the fence repairs as if nothing had happened. But in truth, he knew his peaceful routine was under threat. Before, he'd only suspected Wolf's arrival. Now it was a certainty. And if Wolf followed the same pattern he reportedly used elsewhere, starting small but escalating quickly, Thomas had no illusions that talk would suffice next time. That evening, Thomas allowed himself a rare indulgence, a careful review of the concealed gear he had locked away years earlier. The barn's rear corner was stacked with old crates. Beneath dusty tarps lay equipment wholly out of place on a typical farm: tripwire alarms, camouflage netting, even an outdated but functional surveillance system. In a metal chest, he kept firearms wrapped in oilcloth, each meticulously maintained. He had hoped never to touch these items again, but Wolf's visit changed that calculation. He spent the next few days shoring up defenses. First, he walked the perimeter, installing simple motion sensors near natural choke points: a hedgerow, an old fence gap, a dry creek bed that could provide an easy approach for intruders. He reasoned that if Wolf's men returned in numbers, they'd try to avoid the main driveway where they'd be easily spotted. Thomas wanted to know the moment they set foot on his land. He also set up a few non-lethal deterrents. Using fireworks and blank round popper rigs he'd learned to improvise in his old line of work, he created devices that would flash and bang when triggered, hopefully startling intruders and giving him an advantage. If Wolf pushed him into a corner, Thomas would respond, but he intended to minimize bloodshed if at all possible. Meanwhile, he still had his crops to tend and animals to feed, so his days remained busy. Any neighbor stopping by would see him engaged in typical farm chores, none the wiser to his hidden preparations. He liked it that way. The last thing he wanted was to spark panic or invite more rumors about his past. Let them think he was just a hardworking old man who minded his own business. But some tension was now unavoidable. A couple of neighbors confided that they too had been approached by Wolf's crew. Thinly veiled threats coupled with pitiful purchase offers. One elderly couple had relented, selling their small orchard at half its market value. Their eyes brimmed with shame when they told Thomas, admitting they were simply too scared to stand firm. Thomas listened, offered what comfort he could, but said little about his own plans. After they left, however, he found himself walking his property lines again, half to check for any sign of trespass, half to clear his head. He replayed that moment when Wolf had confronted him, noticing the gang leader's calculating stare and how he seemed almost amused by the prospect of a fight. Thomas recognized Wolf as a predator, someone who fed on fear and submission. For years, Thomas had tried to leave conflict behind, but seeing the terror sown in his peaceful community, he couldn't ignore the parallels to situations he'd once encountered in other corners of the world. If Wolf was determined to spread mayhem, Thomas would oppose him. This time, though, his mission wasn't in some far-flung war zone. It was at home, defending a land and a life he cherished more than anything else. Bad news traveled fast. Within a week, multiple neighbors had either quietly sold or were considering it. One family found strange footprints around their stables in the dead of night. Another noticed cryptic graffiti sprayed on a silo warning, "Last chance." Sheriff Dugan did what he could. He stepped up patrols, but with only a handful of deputies spread across a large rural area, he couldn't be everywhere at once. Thomas realized that if Wolf was systematic, he would try again soon. Late one afternoon, after checking the irrigation system, Thomas retreated inside his farmhouse to make a phone call he had hoped never to make. He scrolled through a worn address book, finger lingering on a number. After a few rings, a raspy voice answered, "Tom, this is a surprise." "Crowley," Thomas said, leaning against the kitchen wall. "I've run into a situation." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Crowley replied, "Tell me." Thomas succinctly described Wolf's pattern: threats, violence, forced buyouts, without diving into every local detail. He added, "This is my home now, Crowley. Good people live here. I can't let them be terrorized." Crowley listened intently. Though he and Thomas had served together years ago, they'd gone separate ways trying to shed the old life. Crowley specialized in consulting work, security, rescue, and sometimes the kind of off-the-record intervention that local law enforcement couldn't handle alone. "I can send a small team if things get heated," Crowley offered. "We'll keep a low profile, wait nearby. But you sure you want to go down this road?" Thomas closed his eyes. "I'd rather not. but I won't stand by if they push me. Crowley promised to keep his phone on hand and come if called. Their conversation ended with the kind of unspoken understanding shared by two men who had once relied on each other under extreme conditions. For the next few nights, Thomas slept lightly, staying alert for engine noises or the glare of headlights crossing his fields. At dusk, he made rounds, checking cameras and adjusting his improvised traps. For the most part, the evenings remained quiet, almost eerily so. Yet he sensed the calm before the storm. By the time the weekend arrived, Thomas heard from a neighbor that Wolf's men had been spotted harassing a family in the next county over. Another neighbor mentioned seeing motorcycle lights on the perimeter of Thomas's land the previous night. Taking stock of everything, Thomas felt certain a confrontation was imminent. There was a flicker of regret in him. He disliked violence and had chosen this farm for peace. But if Wolf tried to invade his home, Thomas intended to stand his ground. As he locked up the barn one night, stepping into the moonlit yard, he took a breath of the warm summer air. The crickets chirped, and a gentle wind rustled the rows of corn. Somehow this serene landscape felt all the more precious and all the more worth defending. Before the expected storm could descend, an unexpected phone call cut through Thomas's daily routine. He was inside organizing tools when the old landline rang, an antique bell chime echoing through the farmhouse hallway. He picked up to hear Linda Adams's voice on the other end, bright, warm, and just a bit breathless with excitement. She explained that she, Marcus, and their now-grown children wanted to visit the county and wondered if they could stop by. Thomas's initial surprise gave way to a gentle smile. Though they'd exchanged holiday cards and letters over the years, he hadn't seen the Adams family in person since the flood rescue. Linda's tone suggested they'd been searching for his number for quite a while. "Come on by," he said, clearing his throat. "I'd be glad to see you." Despite the tension involving Wolf, he hoped the reunion might bring a welcome sense of normalcy. A few days later, a sedan carefully navigated the bumpy gravel driveway. Out stepped Linda and Marcus, along with Dylan, now in his early 20s, and Becky, a teenager with wide, curious eyes. The entire family looked both excited and a little overwhelmed by the wide-open farmland. Thomas greeted them with a handshake that turned into a quick hug, noting how Dylan and Becky had grown since the frantic night he'd guided them through floodwaters. "Mr. Callahan," Dylan said, voice deep but respectful. "Finally good to meet you again in person, sir." Thomas simply smiled and gestured for them to come inside, where he had sweet tea and sandwiches ready. Over lunch, the conversation flowed freely, reminiscing about the storm, catching up on how each of their lives had progressed. Marcus mentioned that they planned to stay in a small motel in the nearby town, but hoped to spend plenty of time at the farm. "We'd love to help out however we can," he said. "Our way of showing appreciation for everything you did and still do." Linda nodded vigorously, adding that she and Becky would love to assist in the kitchen or tend the vegetable garden if allowed. Thomas's reservations surfaced. Would having them around put them in danger, given Wolf's looming threat? He decided not to alarm them with all the details yet. But as the hours passed, Linda and Marcus sensed a tension he couldn't fully mask. Eventually, Thomas admitted that a group had been causing trouble for local landowners, and that it might escalate. "I don't want you worried," he said, "but if something seems off, let me know." That evening, the Adamses insisted on helping with small farm tasks, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, even cleaning tools in the barn. For a little while, laughter echoed through the property as Becky giggled at the horses' playful nibbles, and Dylan tried his hand at mending a broken gate under Thomas's guidance. But behind Thomas's good-natured smile, he was already forming contingency plans. If Wolf's men arrived while the Adams family was here, he wanted to be sure no one would get caught off guard. Not long after the Adams family settled into a comfortable routine at the farm, Wolf reappeared. This time, he didn't bother sending a small scouting party. One morning, the rumble of motorcycles announced the arrival of 5 men, led by the same scar-faced Wolf who had confronted Thomas before. They parked near the farmhouse, dismounting with an air of ownership. Thomas had been walking back from the fields with Marcus when they saw the bikes. Marcus, noticing the hardened expressions of the riders, tensed up. Thomas, however, kept his face impassive. Wolf removed his helmet and strode forward. "Changed your mind yet, old man?" he asked, voice dripping with contempt. "I hear you've got visitors. Things could get messy if you don't listen to reason." Marcus felt a flash of protective anger, but Thomas subtly gestured for him to keep calm. He stepped forward, meeting Wolf's gaze. "I've already given you my answer," he said quietly. "The land's not for sale. You'd be wise to leave these folks alone." The glare Wolf returned was laced with fury. "Let's just say we'll give you a little more time," he growled. "But if you keep resisting, accidents happen, property gets damaged, people get hurt." One of his men spat on the ground for emphasis. They turned, revving their motorcycles back to life. As they pulled away in a swirl of dust, Marcus exhaled shakily. "They're not bluffing, are they?" he asked Thomas. Thomas's lips tightened. "No," he responded. "They've done this elsewhere. If they come back again, I expect they'll be looking for a fight." Marcus followed Thomas to the barn, where he got his first glimpse of the hidden gear: surveillance screens, motion sensor readouts, and carefully stored firearms. Marcus stared, a mix of confusion and realization washing over him. "You're more than just a farmer," he whispered. "Used to be," Thomas said, not proud but not ashamed either. "I've tried to keep that part of my life buried. Yet here we are." Marcus's shock gave way to resolve. "My family's in the middle of this. If they come, I want to help." Thomas studied him for a moment. "Your priority," he said gently, "is to keep Linda and the kids safe. I'll handle Wolf, but if things go bad, I'll need a hand." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. Later, Thomas briefed Linda, Becky, and Dylan on what had happened. He didn't sugarcoat Wolf's threats, but emphasized that the best course was to avoid direct confrontation. "If you hear an alarm or see anything suspicious, get inside, barricade yourselves, and call for help. I have a safe area in the barn's sublevel. I'll show you how to reach it." Linda grew pale, glancing nervously at Becky. Dylan's jaw set firmly. Despite his fear, he seemed determined to prove himself. As dusk approached, Thomas walked the perimeter once again, double-checking his hidden traps and sensors. He spotted Linda watching him from the porch, worry etched across her face. He gave her a reassuring nod, hoping that tomorrow might pass without incident. But deep down, he knew Wolf's next visit would escalate matters. This time, there would likely be no polite warning before violence began. The Adams family quickly pitched in to fortify the farm. Marcus and Dylan installed extra locks on all the doors, while Linda and Becky helped lay down thick planks to reinforce the barn windows from the inside. To some, these measures might have seemed extreme, but after watching Wolf's men ride in with open threats, the family understood the stakes. It wasn't paranoia, it was prudence. One afternoon, while Linda and Becky prepared lunch, Thomas quietly pulled Marcus aside. He guided him through a narrow passage in the barn to a small, concealed area, partly underground, reinforced with wooden beams. When Marcus saw the storage shelves lined with emergency supplies and multiple firearms, his eyes widened. Thomas handed him a pistol and a small box of ammunition. "I hope you never have to use this," he said softly. "But if they manage to corner you, don't hesitate." Marcus swallowed hard, nodding. He had handled firearms before, though never in a life-or-death context. Even so, he appreciated Thomas's trust. Together, they walked through the steps for the family's evacuation. Linda, Becky, and Dylan would lock themselves in this safe room if Wolf's gang overran the property. Marcus would stay with them unless Thomas specifically called for backup. Meanwhile, Dylan, restless and wanting to help more, volunteered to learn the farm's layout. Under Thomas's watchful eye, he jogged the fence line, noting where tripwires were placed. He also practiced quickly shutting gates that could funnel intruders into narrow areas. Though Dylan was only in his early 20s, he showed an eagerness to defend his loved ones. Thomas offered quiet reassurance, reminding Dylan that bravery didn't always mean rushing into a fight. Often it was knowing how to avoid one. Tension hovered like a storm cloud. Locals whispered that Wolf's gang was stationed just beyond the county line, possibly awaiting reinforcements before making a grand show of force. Sheriff Dugan had stepped up patrols on major roads, but these criminals seemed adept at avoiding direct encounters with law enforcement, operating in the silent hours of night. Each evening, Thomas made sure everyone knew the plan. If the alarm sounded, Linda and Becky would head for the barn's sublevel, with Dylan and Marcus ensuring they got inside. Thomas would handle any immediate threat outside, counting on the traps and vantage points he'd set up to give him an edge. They walked through the scenario once more at sunset, an impromptu drill that felt simultaneously surreal and sobering. Becky, who had initially treated the farm like a grand vacation, now looked anxious, gripping her mother's hand with white knuckles. In moments of downtime, the family tried to keep the mood light, playing cards around the kitchen table or telling funny stories about city life versus rural life. Still, an undercurrent of dread remained. Thomas could see it in Linda's eyes, in the way Marcus double-checked the lock each time he shut a door. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable clash, hoping that if it came, they would emerge unscathed. Night fell quiet for several days, almost lulling them into a false sense of security. Then in the early hours of a humid summer morning, the motion sensors blared. A piercing alarm from Thomas's handheld device jolted him awake. Throwing on a jacket, he hurried to the surveillance monitors in the barn. Through the grainy feeds, he counted at least 8 figures creeping along the southeast fence line. Wolf's men armed with rifles and flashlights. 2 more circled from the northwest, likely intending a pincer move. He quickly radioed Marcus on a small walkie-talkie. "They're here. Get Linda and the kids to the safe room. Stay put unless I call." Marcus's acknowledgement was tense but steady. Thomas then grabbed his rifle, flipping on a secondary monitor to track the intruders. Outside, the men advanced under cover of darkness, but they hadn't counted on Thomas's tripwire traps. As the lead pair edged toward the barn, a sudden explosion of light and noise, firecrackers rigged to a small flash charge, erupted, scattering them. Shouts followed. The would-be attackers fumbled for cover behind a tractor, confusion swirling under the flickering glare. Thomas used the distraction to slip outside, keeping low. From behind stacked hay bales, he aimed his rifle toward the flankers. He fired warning shots, bullets pinging off a metal water trough near them. Instantly, the group dove to the ground, returning wild, panicked fire that went well above Thomas's position. Though he was outnumbered, the farm's layout gave him a crucial advantage. Meanwhile, down below in the safe room, Linda and Becky clutched each other, hearts pounding. Dylan stood near the entrance with Marcus, pistol in hand, flinching at every muffled gunshot. In hushed voices, they wondered if Thomas was all right. Marcus reminded them to keep quiet. Any noise could give away their location if intruders got inside. Outside, Wolf's voice cut through the chaos. "Spread out. Don't let one old man corner you." He seemed furious that Thomas had set the perfect ambush. Another flash charge detonated as one of his men tripped a wire, briefly illuminating Wolf's silhouette. Thomas fired off another round, aiming near Wolf's feet to force him to retreat. Wolf cursed, barked orders for his men to regroup. Sensing they were pinned, a few of the bikers attempted to skirt around the far side of the farmhouse, possibly hoping to force entry. Thomas spotted their movement on the camera feeds, hustling to intercept them. He tossed a smoke canister, an old military leftover, across the path, engulfing them in a thick haze that made them cough and stumble. Taking advantage, Thomas advanced, disarming 2 startled men who could barely see through the smoke. Yet the numbers game threatened to tip against him. Wolf had at least 10 men on the property. If they organized and pushed en masse, Thomas might not hold them at bay for long. He flicked on his walkie-talkie. "Crowley, you close?" he asked, voice tight with urgency. A crackle answered, "On our way. Hang in there." Unbeknownst to Wolf, Thomas had earlier signaled Crowley, requesting that he and his small team stay nearby in case the worst happened. As the firefight continued, adrenaline surged through Thomas. His carefully placed traps were forcing Wolf's men to move in predictable routes, but the intruders were becoming more aggressive. Wolf himself appeared to have regrouped with several gunmen near the tractor, barking orders to encircle the farmhouse. Thomas ducked behind a woodpile as rounds whizzed by, splinters flying. From the barn, Marcus peered through a narrow gap in the boarded-up window. His instincts screamed to help Thomas, but he remembered his promise to keep Linda, Becky, and Dylan safe unless Thomas gave the all-clear. Dylan's face was pale in the dim light of the safe room. Even Becky, who tried to stay brave, was trembling. Linda silently gripped Becky's hand, praying that Thomas would somehow keep them from harm. Out in the yard, Wolf tried a new tactic. One of his men tossed a Molotov cocktail toward the farmhouse porch, aiming to smoke Thomas out. The flame burst against the wooden steps, flickering dangerously close to igniting the whole structure. Thomas reacted instantly, sprinting from cover to beat out the flames with a heavy blanket he'd snatched from a bench. Bullets snapped past him, and he nearly lost his footing, but he managed to douse the fire before it spread. Gasping from exertion, he retreated behind the shed, scanning the cameras. Wolf's men were spreading out in a semicircle, determined not to let him slip away. Thomas's heart pounded. His ammunition wouldn't last forever, and a single unlucky shot could bring everything crashing down. He thumbed the walkie-talkie again, urging Crowley to hurry. As if on cue, a new noise cut across the night, the rumble of SUVs and motorcycles. But not Wolf's. Two off-road vehicles and a pair of bikes screeched onto the property from the north side. High-beam headlights lit up the fields, revealing half a dozen figures stepping out. Crowley and his companions, armed with legally registered rifles and shotguns. They positioned themselves strategically, pinning Wolf's group between Thomas on one flank and Crowley on the other. Wolf's men balked, clearly not expecting a second wave of defenders. Some attempted to flee, only to be blocked by Crowley's vehicles. Crowley himself shouted through a bullhorn, "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." Panic flickered in the eyes of Wolf's lieutenants. A few fired sporadic shots, but Crowley's team returned precise, controlled fire, forcing them to hit the dirt. Wolf roared in frustration, but even he seemed to grasp how badly their plan had unraveled. Realizing an all-out firefight could lead to casualties, Thomas rose from cover and took a position where Wolf could see him. His voice was firm. "It's over, Wolf. Back off and nobody has to die here." Wolf glared, eyes darting in desperation. The property now bristled with well-placed defenders on all sides. A bead of sweat rolled down Wolf's scarred cheek. For a tense moment, it seemed Wolf might try one last suicidal rush. But the presence of Crowley's heavily armed team made it clear any such move would end badly. At last, Wolf threw his pistol to the ground with a snarl, shouting for his men to stand down. Weapons clattered on the dirt. Thomas let out a slow breath, keeping his rifle trained until he was certain their surrender was genuine. With the immediate threat diffused, Thomas signaled Marcus via the walkie-talkie. "You can come out," he said, voice tight with residual adrenaline. Cautiously, Marcus, Linda, Becky, and Dylan emerged from the barn's sublevel, eyes wide at the sight of the subdued attackers scattered across the yard. Several of Wolf's men knelt or lay prone, hands laced behind their heads, guarded by Crowley's team. As Linda rushed forward, she threw her arms around Thomas, tears of relief glistening. Becky clung to Dylan, visibly shaken by the gunfire and chaos. Marcus exhaled a ragged breath, spotting one of the half-burned porch steps where a Molotov had nearly caught fire. It sank in just how close they had come to losing everything. Crowley approached, giving Thomas a curt nod. "You timed that call about right," he said wryly, scanning the property. These guys were clearly geared up for a fight. "You all okay?" Thomas nodded, then introduced Crowley to the Adams family. Linda thanked him profusely. Dylan and Becky, still in shock, managed small, appreciative smiles. Moments later, distant sirens pierced the night. Alerted by neighbors who heard shots, Sheriff Dugan and several deputies arrived, flashing lights casting blue and red patterns across the farm. Initially, they drew their weapons, unsure what they were walking into. Crowley and Thomas lowered their rifles and calmly explained the situation. Wolf's men had attacked in an attempt to force Thomas off his land, and the defenders had acted purely in self-defense. Assessing the scene, evidence of forced entry, the scorch marks on the porch, the firearms Wolf's crew had dropped, Sheriff Dugan wasted no time ordering the intruders handcuffed. Wolf spat curses, still glaring at Thomas like he was memorizing every detail of the old farmer's face for some future vendetta. But with multiple eyewitnesses and contraband weapons now in plain sight, there was little Wolf could do but snarl as deputies hauled him away. Once the sirens receded and the last deputy car pulled out, the farm fell silent except for the clank of Crowley's team gathering their gear. Thomas surveyed the property. Bullet holes pocked the barn siding, shattered glass glinted in the grass, and a heavy odor of sulfur hung in the warm night air. It would take time to repair the damage, but the land was still his, and more importantly, everyone he cared about was safe. He turned to Crowley. "I can't thank you enough," he said quietly. Crowley shrugged. "We go way back. You'd do the same for me." Thomas understood that was true, though he'd hoped never to put Crowley in that position. Meanwhile, Marcus and Linda came up, each shaking Crowley's hand, expressing gratitude on behalf of their family. At last, with the crisis resolved, Crowley's team packed up, leaving behind a subdued but hopeful sense that the worst had passed. By dawn, the farm resembled a battlefield abandoned after a skirmish. Empty shell casings glimmered in the first rays of sunlight. The porch bore scorched edges from the thwarted Molotov attempt, and a window in the barn had been fractured by stray bullets. Despite the destruction, Thomas felt only gratitude that no one had been seriously hurt on either side. In the days that followed, the county buzzed with stories of how a mysterious ex-soldier farmer and his allies had routed Wolf's gang. While some of the more dramatic rumors blew details out of proportion, the core facts remained. Wolf was in custody, along with many of his henchmen, thanks to Thomas's stand and Crowley's timely intervention. The Adams family, who had never expected to be caught in a rural siege, stayed on to help Thomas begin repairs. Marcus and Dylan nailed up new boards over the barn window, while Becky and Linda cleared debris in the yard. Over the next couple of weeks, they managed to replace broken fences and patch bullet holes. Sheriff Dugan dropped by occasionally, checking in on their progress and taking additional statements for the investigation. With tangible proof of Wolf's extortion attempts and assault on the property, prosecutors seemed confident in securing convictions. Neighbors who had sold their farms under threat emerged with a renewed desire for justice. A few began discussing possible legal actions against Wolf's network, hoping to recover some of their financial losses. Thomas supported their cause, though he maintained a low profile when it came to the press. He gave only one brief interview, stating simply that he was glad the county was safe again and that any capable person would have acted as he did. Meanwhile, the Adams family felt torn. They were grateful to have helped and relieved that the danger had subsided, yet deeply unsettled by how close they'd come to disaster. Dylan, in particular, wrestled with his emotions. "I never thought I'd see gunfire like that outside of the movies," he told Thomas, shaking his head at the memory of muzzle flashes lighting up the fields. Thomas placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "Neither did I, when I first bought this place," he said quietly. Yet behind the relief, Linda and Marcus felt an even stronger urge to repay Thomas. After all, he had saved them not once, but twice, first from the flood and now from armed criminals. Linda confided to Marcus that simply saying thank you or offering money felt inadequate. Thomas was the kind of man who didn't hunger for wealth, and he seemed disinclined to accept charity. But the seed of a more significant, lasting gesture had already sprouted in their minds. They just needed to figure out how best to present it to him. Eventually, the Adams family faced the reality that they would have to return to the city. Their jobs and obligations couldn't be postponed forever. However, none of them wanted to leave Thomas's farm without first ensuring he was well taken care of, both for the immediate recovery and for the long haul. On their final weekend, Linda walked with Thomas beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak that stood near the property boundary. Its thick shade offered relief from the midday sun, and the hum of cicadas filled the air. She hesitated before speaking. "Thomas," she began, "you know we're beyond grateful, but I'm worried you'll try to shoulder all this on your own, fixing bullet holes, reinforcing your home, dealing with the fallout from Wolf's gang." Thomas shrugged in his understated way. "I've managed so far. Besides, I reckon the worst is behind us. Once Wolf's men realize how things ended, they'll scatter." Linda studied his face, reading the fatigue behind his calm expression. "Even so, we can't just drive away and pretend everything's fine." Meanwhile, Marcus had been busy consulting a few colleagues from his line of work. He returned to the farm that afternoon, calling Linda, Dylan, and Becky together, then inviting Thomas to join them around a makeshift table in the barn. On it lay a sheaf of documents sealed in an envelope. Clearing his throat, Marcus said, "Thomas, we know you'd never ask for anything in return, but please hear us out. We've arranged something we hope will help secure your farm's future." He slid the envelope toward Thomas. Inside were papers detailing a fund Marcus and Linda had established, dedicated to upgrading and safeguarding the property. Everything from modern security systems to solar panels, improved irrigation, and structural enhancements to the barn and farmhouse. Marcus explained, "I work in real estate development. We can source materials at cost, and my business partners are willing to do the labor at a fraction of the usual price." Thomas blinked, momentarily speechless. He opened his mouth to protest that he didn't need charity, but Linda quickly added, You gave us more than we can ever repay, our lives, our safety, and a sense of security. This is just us trying to show how much that matters. Dylan chimed in. Dad's right. We can do a lot to make this farm stronger. And if some other gang ever tries the same stunt, you'll be even better prepared. Thomas ran a calloused hand over the documents. He thought of how any improvements would benefit not just him, but the entire community in the long run. Still, it was a monumental offer, and humility made him hesitant. I don't know what to say, he finally managed. Linda gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Say yes, she murmured, smiling through glistening eyes. Please let us do this. For all you've done and might do in the future, if this land ever needs protecting again. After a long silence, Thomas closed the folder and nodded. All right, he said softly, voice thick with emotion. If it means that much to you, I accept. Thank you. Relief and gratitude sparkled in Linda's gaze, while Marcus exhaled a breath he'd apparently been holding. Becky grinned widely, and Dylan clapped a hand on Thomas's back, as though welcoming him into their family all over again. That night, they shared one last dinner together. Nothing fancy, just fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and sweet tea. But the atmosphere was warm, brimming with understanding and mutual respect. While they could never truly repay Thomas for his selfless acts, the Adams family felt this gift would forge a new chapter, ensuring the farm endured as a sanctuary for years to come. 2 days later, the Adams family packed their car amid tearful goodbyes and promises to return soon. I spent on them, this time with a construction crew in tow. Becky clung to Thomas for a final hug, whispering a soft, thank you for everything. Dylan, standing taller than ever, offered a handshake that turned into a quick embrace. Marcus and Linda each took turns expressing their gratitude in more words than Thomas usually cared to hear, but he listened patiently, touched by their sincerity. Standing at the edge of the driveway, Thomas waved until their car disappeared beyond the pines lining the road. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the battered fields where, only a short while ago, gunfire and threats of violence had shattered the peace. Now there was a renewed sense of optimism. With Wolf's crew dismantled, legal action pending, and the Adamses' pledge to fortify the property, Thomas felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Not that everything was suddenly perfect. The barn roof still had a few bullet holes, and the farmhouse porch needed major repairs from the Molotov damage. Some neighbors were still anxious about potential retaliation from any stray members of Wolf's outfit. Thomas maintained a watchful eye, keeping his cameras active and occasionally placing a call to Crowley for updates. Crowley reassured him that most of Wolf's men had scattered or been arrested, and the odds of any organized comeback looked slim. Thomas also took time to reflect on his own internal journey. He had come to this quiet county hoping to leave conflict behind, yet he'd been forced to confront violence once more. In doing so, he had discovered that his protective instincts still ran strong, perhaps stronger than ever. But there was also a sense of fulfillment in using his skills to shield those in need, much as he had the night he rescued the Adams family from the flood. He spent the next few weeks methodically repairing the farm, applying what resources he had until Marcus and Linda's promised upgrades could materialize. Each repair job felt like restoring balance to the land, a way of assuring it that the chaos had passed. News traveled too. People as far as the next county over heard about the veteran farmer who'd refused to be intimidated. Some neighbors dropped by with pies and casseroles, expressing quiet thanks for his stance against the criminals. Others simply offered a friendly wave, acknowledging that someone in their midst had stood firm. Thomas appreciated their gestures, but he never sought the limelight. He chalked it all up to doing what was right. In the cool evenings, he would sit on the porch, newly patched but still scarred, watching the sun set over fields of corn and wheat. Occasionally, he'd recall the echoes of gunfire or the frantic calls for help from that distant flood night. Both memories reminded him that true peace always had to be guarded, whether against raging water or ruthless men. Autumn arrived in a blaze of color, red and gold leaves fluttering across the farm. True to their word, the Adams family came back with a small caravan of trucks carrying lumber, insulation, solar panels, and various construction materials. Marcus had assembled a trusted crew, people he'd worked with on big city development projects, now eager to try their hands at something more personal. Over the course of several weeks, the crew installed solar panels on the barn roof and modernized the water irrigation lines for Thomas's crops. They added reinforced doors to the house and barn, replaced broken windows with shatter-resistant glass, and even rewired part of the electrical system. Linda spent time repainting the interior walls, brightening up rooms that had long been dim and spare. Dylan and Becky juggled classes with helping out, driving up on weekends to lend a hand where they could, hauling lumber, hammering nails, painting fences. Thomas found himself overwhelmed more than once, but in a good way. Never thought I'd see the day this place would look so modern, he admitted, watching a crew member align the final row of solar panels. Marcus, measuring a door frame for reinforcement, responded with a grin. It's still your farm, Thomas. Just more efficient now. You'll save on utilities, too. Throughout the construction, neighbors would stop by, astonished at the transformation. Some asked if they might replicate the solar setup or the improved security measures. Thomas always wanted to help, introduce them to Marcus, who gladly shared advice. The sense of community, fragile before, strengthened as people realized they could support each other to stand against future threats, whether from criminals or natural disasters. Meanwhile, the Adams family's relationship with Thomas deepened. They'd already shared two life-altering events, but now they built an ongoing connection. One evening, after a long day of construction, Linda cooked a huge pot roast for everyone, serving it with homemade biscuits and fresh vegetables from the farm's garden. The group gathered in the newly reinforced barn, makeshift tables assembled from stacks of lumber. Laughter echoed as Becky recounted an accidental tumble into the duck pond, or Dylan joked about nearly putting a fence post in upside down. Thomas watched them with quiet contentment. It felt as though fate had drawn them together multiple times, first through a raging flood, then under the threat of armed thugs. Now they were rebuilding and improving the farm that had sheltered them all. The irony wasn't lost on him. A rescue he'd once seen as a single act of compassion had evolved into a bond that spanned years and overcame formidable challenges. When the construction team finally packed up their tools, the farm stood transformed. A fresh coat of paint brightened the farmhouse. A row of solar panels gleamed atop the barn's shingles, and motion sensor spotlights lined the perimeter. Thomas insisted on paying for at least part of the labor, but Marcus and Linda brushed him off. We agreed this was our way of giving back, Marcus said firmly. Let us. Stepping back to observe the final result, Thomas felt something akin to awe. The land was still the same precious piece of earth he loved, but now fortified for the future, a testament to resilience and the kindness of those he'd once saved. Perhaps the best repayment of all was seeing how compassion had come full circle, forming a lasting legacy he could share with the people who now felt like family. Eventually, the Adamses returned to the city, their vehicles lighter by the absence of construction materials, but heavier with a sense of accomplishment. They left Thomas with a standing invitation to visit them whenever he wanted, a prospect he found strangely appealing, though he was far from a city person. As they drove off, he waved from the newly repaired driveway, reflecting on the incredible journey that had led them all to this point. In the following months, the farm settled into a peaceful rhythm. Sheriff Dugan confirmed that most of Wolf's gang members had accepted plea deals or faced trials, and no credible threats lingered on the horizon. The county breathed easier, farmers returning to their daily tasks without the shadow of intimidation looming overhead. Some neighbors followed Thomas's example, installing basic motion sensors or reinforcing their homes, recognizing the value of preparedness. Thomas gradually returned to simpler routines, waking at dawn to tend the fields, mending fences, caring for livestock. But the farm itself was anything but the same old place. His new security system automatically flicked on bright spotlights if anyone drew near after dark. The barn's solar power setup reduced his electric bills and ensured he always had backup energy for emergency pumps, a critical safeguard given how flash floods could strike without warning in this region. Occasionally, Linda or Marcus would call to check in, updating Thomas on their lives. Dylan once visited on his own, explaining he had a break from college and wanted to see the coolest place he'd ever been. He helped Thomas harvest a late crop of vegetables, and in the evenings, they sat on the porch, its scorched boards long replaced, talking about everything from farm life to how to face adversity with courage. One afternoon, Thomas received a postcard with a picture of a city skyline. It was from Becky, who wrote about her latest school project and how she missed the quiet nights at his farm. She mentioned she couldn't wait to come back for a weekend escape from the urban hustle. Smiling, Thomas pinned the card to a corkboard near the kitchen door, feeling an odd sense of parental pride. Although he'd never craved attention, a local newspaper eventually did a modest feature on him, titled "The Farmer Who Stood His Ground." The piece highlighted how a single individual's refusal to yield to criminal threats could galvanize an entire community. Thomas found it mildly embarrassing but admitted the article might encourage others to protect their homes with more confidence. He was pleased that it also gave credit to the Adams family for returning and helping rebuild. As time passed, the memory of Wolf's violent intrusion began to fade like a distant storm. Yet the farm bore living evidence that courage and kindness could prevail against brute force. Every modern reinforcement, every newly coated wall, every sign of prosperity stood as a quiet reminder of how the seeds of compassion, planted years earlier when Thomas rescued a desperate family from raging floodwaters, had bloomed into a reciprocal act of goodwill. Late one autumn evening, Thomas stood by his sturdy, renovated porch, gazing across the fields shimmering under a harvest moon. The crickets sang their lullaby, and a soft breeze rustled the crops. In that tranquil moment, he remembered Linda's words, how a single act of kindness could bridge lives in unimaginable ways. He closed his eyes, breathing in the crisp air, content with the knowledge that his farm, his home, and his chosen life were secure. Somewhere out there, the Adams family also gazed at the same moon, forever bound to him by gratitude and unspoken promise. Looking back on Thomas's incredible journey, I'm struck by how one act of kindness can ripple across years, drawing people together to overcome even the gravest threats. This is more than just a story about standing up to criminals. It's a testament to the bonds formed through compassion, resilience, and second chances. From rescuing a family in a raging flood to outsmarting a biker gang on his beloved farm, Thomas personifies the quiet strength we all hope to find in ourselves. It reminds me that true heroism often blossoms in ordinary lives, sparked by the determination to protect what matters most. It's a beacon of hope that, no matter how dark the night might seem, light can still prevail with the right people standing shoulder to shoulder. I invite you to share your thoughts, reactions, or any stories of your own in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going.